want to start there, because that's the part that still keeps me up. Not the footprints themselves, the snow, the way it had fallen the night before, a clean 4 inches over everything, smoothing the whole valley into one unbroken sheet. When you've worked land long enough, you learn to read snow like a page. Fresh snow is honest. It tells you exactly who came and went and when and how heavy they were and whether they were in a hurry. And that morning, the page around the Voss cabin had writing on it that shouldn't have been there. People don't understand how much snow tells you if you spend your life around it. A clean overnight fall is the closest thing the natural world has to a sealed document. Nothing can cross it without leaving a mark. A mouse leaves a mark. A bird that lands and takes off again leaves 2 faint brushstrokes where its wings touched. Wind leaves its own signature, little ridges and combs that you learn to tell apart from anything alive. So when you walk up on a fresh field of it, you're not just looking at white ground. You're looking at a record that hasn't been tampered with, a few hours old, guaranteed accurate by the simple fact that snow can't lie about who stepped on it. That's why what I saw that morning mattered so much. It wasn't a rumor, it wasn't a feeling, it was written down in the one medium I trusted completely, and it said something that could not be true. Let me back up, because none of this means anything without the context. My name doesn't matter much. I worked for the county for 11 years as what they call a parcel assessor, which is a fancy way of saying I drove a truck to remote properties and checked whether they matched what the record said. Tax stuff, mostly. Boundary disputes. Inherited land nobody had walked in a generation. The kind of job where you spend more time alone than people think is healthy, and you get comfortable with that, because the alternative is a desk. It's a strange profession. You become an expert in places nobody else ever sees. Old homesteads swallowed by second-growth forest. Mining claims with the head frame rotted down to a few black timbers. Cabins where somebody's whole life happened and ended, and the only proof left is a line item in a county database and a chimney still standing in a field. I'd walked hundreds of these. I knew how abandoned land behaves. I knew the difference between a place people had left and a place people had fled. And after 11 years, I'd developed something I can only call a sense for it, a quiet instinct for when a property was simply empty and when it was empty in a way that meant something. Most were just empty. I want to be clear about that. 99 out of 100 were nothing but old wood and tax history and the slow, patient work of weather. I was not a superstitious man. I'm still not, exactly. I just know one more thing now than I used to. The Voss property came across my desk in late January because of a death. An old woman named Margaret Voss had passed in a care facility down in the city, and she'd left a piece of land up in the high country to a nephew who'd never seen it. 80-some acres, an access road that was barely a road, and one structure listed in the records, a single-room cabin built in 1961, last assessed in person in 1994. That date matters. 94. The last time anyone from the county had physically stood at that cabin was 30 years before I drove up there. After that, it had been assessed remotely by aerial photo and tax payment, the way a lot of these forgotten parcels get handled. Margaret paid her taxes on time every single year, like clockwork, by mail, even though, as far as anyone could tell, she hadn't set foot on the property since her husband died. And her husband had died in 1994, so that was the story on paper. Man dies, widow moves to the city, never goes back, keeps paying taxes out of sentiment or stubbornness, locks the cabin and leaves it sealed for 3 decades until she dies too. Sad, but ordinary. The kind of thing I saw all the time. People hold on to land the way they hold on to grief. They can't use it, and they can't let it go. I'd seen widows keep paying on a worthless acre for 20 years because selling it felt like admitting the person was really gone. I understood it. I filed Margaret Voss under that, the way you file most people, and I didn't think about her again until I was standing in her snow. My job was simple. Drive up, confirm the structure still existed and match the records, photograph its condition, note any changes for the new owner's tax basis, and leave. A 2-hour job, maybe 3 with the drive. I packed a thermos and figured I'd be home by dark. The road in was worse than the map suggested. It usually is. County maps are optimists. The first stretch was decent gravel that climbed steadily out of the valley through stands of bare aspen, the white trunks crowded together like something out of a fairy tale. and then the gravel gave out and became 2 ruts of frozen mud under the snow, and then the ruts gave out too. The last 3 miles weren't plowed and weren't going to be, so I left the truck at a turnout where an old logging spur met the road, and I walked, which I'd done 100 times before. I had snowshoes in the back for exactly this. I strapped them on, checked the bindings twice the way you learn to when you've felt one come loose 2 miles from anywhere, shouldered my pack with the camera and the clipboard and the thermos, and set out. It was cold but clear, that hard bright cold you get in the mountains after a storm passes, where the sky goes a blue so deep it almost hurts and every sound carries forever. The sun was up, but it sat low and gave no warmth, just light, a thin gold light that made the snow throw back so much glare I had to squint even with the day already half gone grey under the trees. I remember the only thing I could hear was my own breathing and the squeak of the snow under each step, that dry, squeaking crunch you only get when it's well below freezing. Above a certain temperature, snow goes quiet and soft underfoot. Below it, every step talks back to you. That morning, every step talked. The cold did something to the silence up there. In the valley, you always have some baseline of sound, a distant road, a dog, the wind working through power lines. 3 miles up that buried road, there was none of it. The storm had passed and taken the wind with it, and what was left was a silence so complete it had a kind of pressure to it, like being underwater. I could hear my own heartbeat when I stopped to rest. I could hear the small tick of snow settling off a branch 100 yards away, clear as a dropped coin. I'd been in quiet country plenty of times. This was something past quiet. This was the kind of silence that makes you start narrating your own thoughts just to have a voice in your head. And I did that, walking, talking myself through the assessment I was about to do, because the quiet was the kind that wants filling. And here's the thing about that walk-in. Mine were the only tracks. The whole way up that buried road, 3 miles of it, the snow was clean. I want you to understand what that means to someone in my line of work. It meant nobody had driven it, nobody had walked it, no animal larger than a squirrel had crossed it, since the snow stopped falling in the small hours of the morning. Not a deer, not an elk, not a single boot. 3 miles of unbroken white, dawn fresh, and the only thing writing on it was me. I was the first living thing of any size to mark that road since the storm. I noticed it the way you notice anything routine, which is to say I didn't really, not consciously. It was just a fact I logged and moved past. I was alone. The land was empty. That was normal. That was, in fact, exactly what the records had promised. A forgotten place at the end of a forgotten road, sealed up and waiting, with nobody within miles. It was only later, much later, sitting in my kitchen, that the cleanness of that road came back to me and turned my stomach. Because if mine were the only tracks coming in, then there was no way for anything to be at the cabin ahead of me. And there was. The cabin sat in a small clearing at the end of the road, backed up against a slope of dark timber, and it was exactly what the records described. A squat little log structure with a steep metal roof to shed snow. 1 door, 2 small windows, a stone chimney. Old, but solid. The kind of thing built by someone who knew what winter could do and respected it. The logs had gone silver grey with age, checked and weathered, but they sat true. No sag in the walls, no lean to the frame. Whoever built it had built it to last, and it had. The metal roof had done its job. The snow had slid off in clean sheets and piled in long drifts against the foundation, leaving the structure itself relatively clear, so that it stood there in the white clearing looking less abandoned than simply asleep. There was no smoke from the chimney, of course, no light in the windows, no sign of anything but 100 winters of patient weather, and against the dark wall of timber behind it, in that thin gold light, it looked almost like a photograph. Like something that had stopped moving a long time ago. I stopped at the edge of the clearing to take my establishing photos, the wide shots that show the structure in its setting. I unslung the camera, framed the cabin against the trees, and put my eye to it. And that's when I saw them. There was a line of footprints in the snow. They came out of the timber on the far side of the cabin, crossed the open clearing, and went up to the cabin door. And then they came back. The same path, more or less, returning to the trees. A loop, out of the woods to the door and back into the woods. My first reaction wasn't fear. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. My first reaction was irritation. Squatters. That was the obvious read, the boring read, the read that fit 11 years of experience. Empty cabin in the high country, somebody had found it and was using it, and now I had a complication on my hands instead of a clean 2-hour assessment. I'd dealt with squatters before. Usually it was kids who'd driven up to drink when no one would bother them. Sometimes hunters using a found shelter. Occasionally somebody genuinely down on their luck who'd holed up somewhere they thought nobody would check. Annoying but human, manageable. A line in the report, a note to the new owner, somebody else's problem by next week. So I lowered the camera and crossed the clearing toward the prints, already composing the email I'd have to write. And that's when the irritation started to curdle into something else, because the prints were fresh. I know fresh prints. Fresh snow takes an impression cleanly and then immediately begins to lose it. The edges round off as the day warms, the surface crusts over at night and dulls the detail. Blown snow drifts into the depressions and softens them. You can date a print to within a few hours if you know what you're looking at. And these were sharp, crisp-edged. No melting at the rims, no overnight crust, no drift in. They'd been pressed into that snow that morning after the fall stopped, which meant sometime in the last few hours. Recent, while I was loading my snowshoes maybe, while I was driving up the valley, while I was walking in. But I'd walked in on the only road, and the only tracks on that road were mine. I stood there doing the math the way you do when something doesn't add up and you assume automatically that the error is yours. Okay, calm down. So whoever made these prints didn't come by the road. Fine, that was strange but not impossible. There were other ways into 80 acres of mountain land if you knew it. Game trails through the timber, the ridge that ran along the back of the property. A person on foot, a local who'd grown up in these hills, could come in from almost any direction without ever touching the road. It didn't have to mean anything. It just meant the squatter was careful, or local, or both. I held on to that. It was a good explanation. It lasted about 30 more seconds. I crouched down to look at the prints properly, the way I'd look at any anomaly on a property, methodically, and that's where the second wrong thing was. The prints didn't make sense as a walk. When a person walks, their stride is even, left, right, a rhythm, with a consistent length between steps that changes only when they speed up, slow down, or the ground changes under them. It's the most automatic thing in the world. You couldn't walk with an irregular stride if you tried. Your body won't do it for long. These prints had no rhythm at all. The spacing between them varied wildly and without pattern. Here, two prints would be close together, almost overlapping, heel nearly touching toe. And then the next one would be a full 4 feet away, a stride no normal person makes on flat ground, and then back to close again. 2 near, 1 far, 3 near, 1 far. It was the spacing of something that kept stopping and starting, stopping and starting, stopping to stand, then moving, then stopping again, all the way across that open clearing, and as if whatever made them had no particular reason to keep a steady pace, as if it were not really going somewhere so much as drifting toward the door in fits. And the prints themselves were wrong. They were the right general size for an adult, maybe a little long, but they were too clean. No tread, no boot pattern, no waffle of a hiking sole, no heel ring, none of the dozen marks any real footwear leaves, just smooth oval depressions, featureless, like someone had walked across the snow in something soft and shapeless that left no detail at all. Slippers was my first thought, which was absurd on its face, because who walks through mountain timber in the dead of winter in slippers, who comes in over a ridge in soft soles with no grip? But that's what the shape suggested. Soft soles, no structure, no edge where a foot ends and a heel begins, just an impression, the way a hand leaves an impression in dough. I told myself snow distorts prints. It does. A print in soft snow can blur its own edges as the walls collapse inward. Maybe the soles had iced over and lost their tread to a smooth coat of frozen snow. Maybe the wind that morning had done something to them I wasn't accounting for. I had 3 or 4 explanations, and I cycled through them, and I noticed that each one required me to ignore something else. The iced sole theory didn't explain the spacing. The wind theory didn't explain why my own approach prints made minutes ago were sharp and detailed while these were smooth. None of them explained how something had reached this clearing without crossing the only road in. I was assembling reasons the way a man stacks sandbags, and the water kept coming in somewhere else. I followed them to the door. The door was closed. There was a padlock on a hasp, old and heavy, and a second lock below it, a deadbolt set into the frame, newer than the padlock, but still decades old. I took hold of the padlock to test it, more out of habit than expectation, and it didn't move. It wasn't just locked. The shackle was solid with rust, fused into the body of the lock in a single seized mass, orange-brown and crumbling at the edges where my glove touched it. A lock like that doesn't get opened. A lock like that has to be cut off, and even cutting it, you'd fight it. It had not been opened in years, many years. The hasp it hung from was rusted into the wood. The screws bled brown stains down the grey logs beneath them. The deadbolt below was thrown, the brass face of it gone dark and pitted. I bent to look at the windows, 2 of them, small, the old kind with real divided panes, both intact. Both latched on the inside. I could see the little brass turn latches in the closed position through the glass, and the glass itself was filmed with the kind of grime that only builds up over decades of nobody touching it. A grey haze of dust and pollen and time, unbroken, no handprints, no wipe marks, nothing. The whole structure was sealed exactly the way you'd expect a building to be sealed if it had genuinely been locked up tight and left alone for 30 years. There was no way in. There was no way anyone had been in. The cabin was a closed box, and it had been a closed box for a very long time. And the footprints went up to that closed box and stopped. There was a cluster of them right at the threshold, that same stop-start spacing all bunched together, dozens of overlapping ovals, the way snow gets churned when someone stands in one place and shifts their weight for a while. Like whoever it was had stood there, stood at that sealed door, in front of that fused lock for a long time. And then the prints turned around and went back the way they'd come, across the clearing and into the trees. Nothing had gone in, nothing had come out. The cabin was undisturbed. Whoever made those prints had walked up to a sealed cabin, stood at a door they could not possibly open, and walked away. I told myself this was good news, actually. I remember the relief of that thought, the way you grab the first stick that floats past when you're going under. The squatter angle was dead, sure, but that was fine, because the locks proved nobody was living in there, which meant I didn't have a confrontation coming, didn't have to clear a structure, didn't have to deal with a person at the end of a road 3 miles from my truck. So this was just somebody who'd wandered up, found the place locked, stood there a while, and left. A hunter, probably, checking if the cabin was usable for shelter, finding it sealed, moving on. The slipper thing I couldn't explain, and the spacing I couldn't explain, and the clean road I couldn't explain. But I bundled all of that together and set it aside, because the bottom line was that the building was sealed and intact, and that was all my job required me to confirm. So I did my job. I photographed the cabin, all 4 sides, the roof, the chimney, the windows, the locks, close-ups of the rust on the padlock to document its condition for the file. I noted that the structure was in excellent shape for its age. And I noted because I'm thorough, because thoroughness was the whole of my professional identity, the presence of unidentified foot traffic in the immediate vicinity. I phrased it carefully, the way you phrase anything that might come back on you. Recent footprints observed approaching the structure from the northeast tree line, no sign of forced entry. Dry, neutral, defensible language. The kind that protects you later, that lets you say you saw it without saying what you thought it meant, because I didn't yet think it meant anything. Not yet. And then I made the choice I will regret for the rest of my life, and I made it for the most ordinary reason imaginable. The prince went into the trees. Some part of me, the diligent part, the part that had kept me employed for 11 years, wanted to confirm the squatter theory by finding wherever it was they'd come from. A camp, a vehicle, a trailhead. The new owner would want to know if somebody was using his land, and I'd want to be the one who found out, because that's what made a good report a thorough one. It felt like doing my job a little better than I had to. So I crossed back across the clearing and walked into the timber, following that strange stop-start trail. I shouldn't have. I know that now. The thing about old-growth timber in deep snow is that it gets very quiet very fast and very dark even at midday. The trees up there were big, old spruce and fir crowded close. their lower branches dead and bare, their crowns laced together overhead into a roof that the storm had loaded with snow. Under that roof, the light went flat and grey and colourless. The bright morning behind me swallowed in a dozen steps. The trees swallowed sound too. That pressing mountain silence got worse the deeper I went, the snow underfoot muffling even the squeak of my own steps until I could barely hear myself moving. You lose your sense of direction quickly in country like that, because every tree looks like the last one and the snow erases the small landmarks you'd normally hold on to. I kept my eye on the trail and my back to the clearing, and I went in. I went maybe 200 yards. The cabin disappeared behind me, hidden by the trees, and when I glanced back I couldn't see the clearing at all anymore, just grey trunks in every direction and the faint blue dimness between them. The silence pressed in until I could hear the blood in my own ears, that high, thin ring you get in true quiet, and I became aware of my own breathing. That's a strange thing to become aware of, your own breath. But in that silence, it was the loudest thing for miles, a ragged in and out fogging the air in front of my face, and I caught myself trying to breathe quietly, trying to make less noise, and I asked myself why I was doing that, who I was trying not to disturb. And I didn't have an answer. It was the first real thread of unease. Not fear yet, just that old animal awareness, the thing older than thinking, that you are somewhere you should not be, somewhere the land does not want you, somewhere the quiet is not empty, so much as it is holding still. The prints led to a place where the timber opened slightly, a small gap where a tree had come down years ago and let a little daylight back in. And there the trail did something I still don't have a clean explanation for, after all this time, after all the nights I've spent trying to find one. It stopped, not faded out, not got lost in a thicket where the snow was thinner under the branches, not joined a harder surface where prints don't take. Stopped. There was a final print, that same smooth, soft oval, clear as the rest, and then beyond it, nothing. Clean, untouched snow in every direction, no prints continuing forward, no prints leading away to either side, no disturbance of any kind, as if whatever had made that trail had walked to that one exact spot in the woods and simply ceased to exist. I stood at the end of the trail for a long time, longer than I should have, with the light already failing. I made myself be methodical, because being methodical was how I kept the unease from becoming something worse. I walked a slow, careful circle around the last print, maybe 30 feet out, scanning the snow the whole way for the place the tracks resumed. There wasn't one. The circle closed and I'd crossed no new prints but my own. I looked up, half thinking, in a way that embarrasses me even now, that maybe somebody had climbed. The branches above were bare and snow-laden and undisturbed, not a clump knocked loose, not a scrape in the frost on the bark. I got down close and looked for any sign that the trail had been brushed out or covered, the way you'd hide a track if you knew how. There was nothing. The surface was perfect, a full unbroken circle of clean snow around one final footprint, with no possible way for the thing that made it to have gotten there or gone from there. A trail doesn't just end. People don't evaporate. There is always an explanation, and standing there I went through everyone I knew. They'd walked backward in their own prints, I thought, stepping carefully into each impression to disguise the direction of travel. People do that. Trappers do it, poachers do it, anybody who doesn't want to be followed. But you can always tell, because walking backward into your own prints is hard, and the impressions get sloppy. The edges smear and double where the foot doesn't land quite cleanly, and these were crisp, single, perfect. And anyway, it didn't explain the beginning of the trail, back at the clearing, where these same prints had come out of clean snow with nothing behind them. No origin, the same impossible way they now ended. The trail had no start and no finish. It existed only in the middle. It was a record of something that had been there without ever arriving or leaving. I gave up. That's the honest word for it. I told myself it wasn't my problem to solve, that the report only needed the structure confirmed, and the structure was confirmed, that the sun was already low enough to throw long blue shadows between the trees, and I had 3 miles to walk back to the truck before dark, and I turned around to follow my own trail out of the timber. and my own trail was right where I'd left it, of course. My snowshoe prints, big and obvious, twin oblong patterns nothing else could make, leading back the way I'd come. I felt better the moment I saw them. They were mine. They were proof of my own passage, a thread back to the world. I started following them, and after about 50 yards I stopped, because there was a second set of prints beside mine now. The soft ovals, no tread, the stop-start spacing, running alongside my snowshoe tracks on the right side, maybe 4 feet away, parallel, steady, heading the same direction I was, toward the clearing, toward the cabin, toward the road and the truck and home. They had not been there when I walked in. I need you to understand that with the same certainty I had standing in that snow, I had walked into those woods watching the ground. Reading the snow is not a thing I do consciously anymore. It's a thing my eyes do on their own after 11 years, the way you can't help but read a sign in your own language. When I came in, there had been one set of tracks beside me, and they were mine, the snowshoes, and nothing else. Now there were 2. Mine, and these fresher than mine, fresher than anything, the edges so sharp and clean they looked cut into the snow with a knife. Made after I passed, made while I was deeper in the woods, standing at the end of that impossible trail, walking my careful circle, looking up into the branches for a man who wasn't there. I'm not proud of what I did next, which was nothing. I stood completely still and I listened for a very long time. The timber was silent, no movement anywhere in it, no shift of weight, no branch settling, no breath but mine. Just me, standing too still, breathing too fast, and 2 sets of tracks in the snow where minutes before there had been one. And then I did what I always do. I reached for the reasonable explanation, because the reasonable explanation is a kind of door you can close behind you. Somebody had walked in along my trail while I was deep in the trees, I told myself. While I was distracted at the dead end, a person had come up my own tracks from the clearing and then turned back, and our paths had simply never crossed because the timber is dense and I'd gone off to the side to walk my circle. It was thin. It was very thin. It required a person to have come 3 miles up a road I knew was untouched, and it didn't explain the soft soles or the stop-start spacing that I now recognized with a cold drop in my stomach, as the exact same gate as the prints at the cabin door. But it was a door I could close, so I closed it, and I started walking. Fast. Following my own snowshoe prints back toward the light. And the second set of prints kept pace. I don't mean they continued in the same direction. I mean they kept pace with me, with my path precisely. Every place my trail bent around a tree, theirs bent with it, holding that same 4-foot distance off my right side, neither closing it nor opening it. Where my prints showed I'd paused and shortened my stride to climb over a low deadfall buried in the snow, theirs showed the same pause at the same place, the same hesitation, the same shortened steps, as if whatever made them had reached that fallen log and considered it exactly as I had. They didn't just go where I went. They did what I did. They had retraced my entire walk into those woods, step for step, decision for decision, holding station off my shoulder the whole way, the way a person walks beside someone they're keeping company with, the way you walk next to someone when you're matching their pace on purpose, so as not to leave them behind. I want to be very clear about something, because it's the part people never quite believe. I never saw anything. There was no figure, no shape moving between the trees, no shadow, no sound. Nothing my eyes could fix on and name. There was only the snow, and what the snow recorded faithfully, honestly, the way it records everything. But that was the whole horror of it. Snow doesn't lie. That's the one thing I built my professional life on. And the snow was telling me, in the only language I fully trusted, that for the entire length of my walk back out of those woods, I had not been alone. That something had walked beside me the whole way, matching me, learning me, and that the only reason I'd felt alone was that it had let me. I came out of the timber into the clearing, and the open light hit me, and I felt something in my chest unclench so hard it nearly buckled my knees. The grey dimness of the trees had gotten into me deeper than I'd realized. The cabin sat there in the low gold light, sealed and silent, the same as I'd left it, and the clearing was open and bright, and I could see the road. And I crossed toward it without stopping, without looking right, without looking at the trail beside me. I had decided I would not look, and I almost made it, but I'm a thorough person, I've told you that. And as I passed the front of the cabin, My eyes did the thing they always do, the thing I couldn't stop them doing, and they read the snow at the door. The footprints at the door had changed. When I'd first arrived, that cluster of prints at the threshold had been facing the cabin. The toes pointed at the door, every one of them, the way they would if someone had walked up and stood there looking at the wood, trying it, waiting in front of it. I knew that for a fact. I had photographed them not 2 hours earlier. The orientation was in my camera, recorded. And now they were turned around. The whole cluster at the threshold pointed outward now, away from the door, away from the cabin, toward the open clearing, toward the road, toward the direction I was walking, as if whatever had stood at that sealed door, facing it, waiting at it, had at some point in the last 2 hours turned around to face the way I was leaving, as though it had turned to watch me go. I didn't stop to photograph it. I didn't stop to think about it, because I knew that if I stood there and thought about it, I wouldn't be able to move at all. I broke into a run, as much as you can run in snowshoes, that lurching, wide-legged shuffle, out across the clearing and onto the buried road, and I ran until my lungs gave out in the cold and burned and forced me down to a walk, and then I walked as fast as a man can walk, and the whole 3 miles back, I did not look at the snow beside me. Not once. Because I was afraid of what the snow might be honest about, and I knew that whatever it told me, I would believe it. I made it to the truck before dark, barely. The last of the light was going purple over the ridge when I reached the turnout. I tore off the snowshoes and threw them in the bed and got in the cab and locked the doors, which is a ridiculous thing to do. Lock the doors of a truck in the middle of empty country, but my hand did it before my mind could object. I started the engine and put the heater on full, and I sat there with it roaring, hands shaking on the wheel, and I made myself breathe, and I made myself think like the rational man I had always been. I had a job. The job had a procedure. I would follow the procedure, and I would drive home, and I would write the report, and the report would turn the whole impossible afternoon back into a normal day of work. Because that is what paperwork does. It takes the unspeakable and files it under a parcel number until it stops being able to look at you. I drove home with the heater on the whole way, far hotter than I needed it. I didn't sleep well, but I slept. And in the morning, in the daylight, in my own kitchen with a coffee going cold in my hand, the whole thing started to feel manageable again. That's the strange power of routine, of ordinary life, of a kettle and a counter and the grey, flat light of a city morning. It dilutes things. It makes the impossible feel like a thing you must have gotten slightly wrong. I pulled the photos off the camera onto my laptop and scrolled through them, and they were just photographs of a cabin in the snow. The footprints were there in the early frames, but small, on a screen, in a bright, safe kitchen. They looked like nothing. Marks in snow. Anything could make marks in snow. I could almost believe I'd imagined the rest of it, the spacing, the mirroring, the turning, the thing that kept pace. Almost. But I'm a thorough person, and being thorough is what undid me in the end. Because I had a question now, and the question would not leave me alone. The cabin had been locked for 30 years, sealed tight, locks rusted solid, nobody in and nobody out since 1994. The records were unambiguous and the physical evidence at the site confirmed them. So what had Margaret Voss locked inside that cabin, and why had she paid the taxes faithfully every single year for 3 decades to keep that one sealed building hers when she never went back to it and never let another living soul through the door? People hold on to land out of grief, I told myself on the drive up. I'd believed it, but I kept turning it over now, and the more I turned it, the less it held. Because grief doesn't usually come with deadbolts. Grief keeps a place the way you keep a grave, tended or untended, but open to you, somewhere you can go. Margaret hadn't tended this place and she hadn't gone to it. She'd sealed it and paid to keep it sealed and stayed away. That isn't how you hold on to something. That's how you contain something. So I did the research. I had access to the full county records, all of it, going back decades before the assessment file. The whole dry paper sediment that builds up under a piece of land over the years. Original deed. Building permit from 1961. Tax history. Payment after payment after payment. A perfect unbroken column of them in Margaret's hand, and then in printed checks. 30 years of money sent faithfully to keep a forgotten acre current. Death certificates. I requested the older files, the ones not digitized, and waited 2 days for someone in records to pull them from storage. And when they came, I sat down with the folder and a coffee, expecting to close the loop, to find the dull human explanation that would let me file the whole thing away and stop checking the snow. The husband's name was Edgar Voss. He died in 1994, which I already knew. What I hadn't known, what had never been in the assessment file because it had no bearing on tax basis, and tax basis was all the assessment file cared about, was how he died. He hadn't died in a hospital or in the city or anywhere that gets a clean, tidy line on a death certificate. He died at the cabin in winter. The certificate listed the cause as exposure, the manner as undetermined, and the location as the property. And under date of death, it gave a range, an estimate, because the date of discovery was nearly 3 weeks later. 3 weeks. He had died at that cabin in the deep of winter, alone, and no one had found him for the better part of a month. And the person who finally did find him, according to the old sheriff's report folded into the back of the file, the report from the office that had handled it at the time, was his wife, Margaret. She'd driven up when the calls stopped being answered, left her car where the road gave out, and walked the last miles in on foot through the snow, the same way I had 30 years before me, to the same cabin. And here is the line from that report. I have read it so many times I could recite it in my sleep, and sometimes I'm afraid I do. The deputy who took Margaret's statement had written it down the way they did back then, in plain longhand, in her own words as near as he could keep them. She said that when she arrived, the cabin was locked from the inside, both locks thrown, the deadbolt and the padlock, both of which could only be fastened from within. She said she had to break one of the windows to get in, and she said that before she broke that window, before she had disturbed anything at all, she walked the whole way around the cabin in the fresh snow, calling Edgar's name, and that there was not a single footprint anywhere, not his, not anyone's. The snow around the cabin lay perfect and unbroken in every direction, smooth as a sheet, as if no living thing had come or gone in weeks. But Edgar was inside, frozen, the door locked from within, the windows latched from within, and no track in the snow outside to show how he'd come to be there, or how a single other soul could have come and gone. A sealed room at the end of an untouched field of snow, with a dead man in it. The deputy had added a note at the very bottom of the page, in different ink, clearly his own and not part of Margaret's account. He wrote that the widow had refused to let them leave the cabin open, that she had insisted, while they were still there, on relocking it, on having the broken window boarded and then replaced, on securing the structure completely before anyone left the site. And he wrote down what she said when they asked her why, and he put it in quotation marks, the way you do when a thing strikes you as strange enough to record exactly. He wrote, "It needs to stay shut. He doesn't like the cold and he can't get warm and he keeps trying the door." And then, for 30 years, she paid the taxes and never went back and never let a living soul inside. I sat in my bright kitchen with my cold coffee and the open folder, and I understood finally what Margaret Voss had spent the last third of her life doing. She had not been holding on to that land out of grief. She had been keeping a door locked. She'd been paying every year faithfully on time to make sure that one sealed building at the top of a forgotten road stayed hers and stayed shut. Not because she loved it, because she was afraid of what would happen if the ownership lapsed, if the place changed hands, if someone went up there who didn't know to leave it closed. She believed, rightly or wrongly, sane or not, and after what I had seen I could no longer be sure which, that something was still on the far side of that door. Something that didn't like the cold and couldn't get warm and kept trying the door. And that the cold itself, the deep, unbroken mountain cold of a sealed cabin nobody ever heated, was the only thing keeping it where it was. She kept it cold. That was the whole secret of her devotion. For 30 years she paid to keep a room cold enough, and then she died. And the land passed to a nephew who had never seen it, who knew none of this, to whom it was just a line in an inheritance. And the county, doing the ordinary thing the county does when land changes hands, opened a file and assigned it for assessment. And the county sent a man up to confirm the structure existed. The county sent me up the untouched road into the clearing to knock on the sealed door and stand in front of it in the snow and read the prints. And then, because I was thorough, because I could not leave a thing half-checked to follow the trail into the trees and walk back out with a companion off my right shoulder, matching me, learning me, keeping me company the whole way to the edge of the property line, where it stopped, where it had to stop. Because that line on paper, the boundary of the land that was still, technically, in the estate, was the last thing holding it. I never filed the full report. I filed a minimal one, the bare structure confirmation, condition noted, and I left out the footprints entirely, and I put in a request to be taken off any further assessment of that parcel, citing access difficulty, which had the advantage of being true. The parcel got reassigned to someone else in the office, and I never asked who, and I never asked what they found. As far as I know, the nephew never went up there. As far as I know, the cabin is still sealed, still locked from whatever it was first locked against, still cold, still paid up. The taxes are current, I'll say that much, and I'll leave it there. I made one quiet arrangement before I left the county, and I would rather not say what it was, except that it concerned the taxes, and that I sleep very slightly better knowing they will not lapse. But none of that is the part that keeps me up. I told you that at the very start. It isn't the locks, or the death certificate, or Margaret's statement, or even the trail in the trees that began and ended in the middle of clean snow. It's the snow, because I keep coming back to the prints at the door, how they faced the cabin when I arrived, all of them pointed at the wood, like something standing at the threshold and trying it, and how they faced outward when I left, turned around in the 2 hours I was there, pointed at the road at the way I was going, like something that had finished waiting at a door, and turned to watch a man leave instead. And I keep coming back to the second set of tracks that appeared beside mine in the timber, that hadn't been there when I went in, that copied my path step for step, and stopped, dead, at the boundary of the property. It learned how I walk. That is the thought I cannot put down, the one that's there every morning before I'm fully awake. Whatever it is, it spent 30 years at a sealed door in the cold with nothing to do and nothing to learn from. And then, one bright morning, a man came walking across its snow, the first warm, living thing in 3 decades, and it followed him. It walked beside him for the better part of a mile. It studied how he moved, the length of his stride, the way he paused at a fallen log, the small habits of a body in motion. It copied him, 4 feet off the right shoulder, the way you walk beside someone when you are learning to be them. And I think about how the snow is honest, how it can't help recording everything that touches it. And I think about how in the city where I live now, far from the high country, it does still snow. Not often, a few times a winter if that. But sometimes, in the deep cold of the year, a clean sheet of it comes down overnight and smooths my whole street into one unbroken page. And I have started in the mornings before anyone else in the house is awake, to go down to the kitchen window and look out at the fresh snow in the yard, just to read it. Just to be sure the only prints out there are the ones that should be. So far, they always have been. Until 3 days ago, it snowed in the night. The first real fall of the year, that same clean 4 inches I'd been dreading without ever letting myself say the word. I came down before light, the way I always do now. And I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and I read the yard the way I read it every morning. My own prints were there. The ones I'd made the evening before. Walking out to the bins and back, already softened a little at the edges the way day-old prints go. Mine, going out yesterday, just like every other morning of my careful new life. I felt my shoulders come down. I let myself breathe. And then I looked at the right side of my tracks. There was a second set running beside them. Smooth ovals, no tread. 4 feet off my right shoulder, holding that exact distance the whole length of the yard. The same stop-start spacing, pausing precisely where I had paused, turning precisely where I had turned. It had walked my walk. It had read the snow the same way I read it, except it wasn't reading. It was practicing. But that wasn't the thing that made me set the coffee down very slowly on the counter so that I wouldn't drop it. The prints at the cabin had come out of the tree line. The prints in the timber had come out of clean snow from nothing, but at least there had been woods around them, somewhere for the impossible to hide. These prints came out of nowhere I could explain at all. They didn't come from the street. They didn't come from the gate. They didn't come over the fence from the neighbor's yard. That snow was perfect, untouched, a clean, white page. The second set of prints simply began out of unbroken snow at the edge of my yard, beside the tracks I'd made the day before, and from there they walked toward the house, alongside my own steps, the whole length of the yard, all the way up to the glass. The last print was directly beneath the window, right where I was standing, on the other side of the pane, a few inches from my own feet, and on the glass, at exactly the height where a face would be if someone had stood out there and leaned in close to look, there was a patch of fog, a small one, the soft oval shape your breath makes when you stand near cold glass and exhale slowly, the way a person breathes when they are studying something on the far side of it, in no hurry, taking their time. It was already fading at the edges as I watched, thinning the way breath thins, returning to clear. But it should not have been there at all. The heat was on inside. The house was warm. The glass under my hand was warm. And breath does not fog warm glass. A warm pane stays clear no matter how close you stand to it or how slowly you breathe. Glass only fogs like that when the cold is on the same side of it as the breath. So I don't open the curtains in the morning anymore. I keep them drawn, and I keep the house warm, warmer than I need it, warmer than is comfortable, warmer than makes any sense on the bills, because the only thing that ever held it was the cold, and there is no cold left in here for it to be at home in. Margaret kept one room cold for 30 years. I am keeping a whole house warm, and I understand now that these are the same act, performed from opposite sides, and I understand that she is dead, and that when she died, the cold she'd been keeping went with her, and the door she'd been paying to hold shut was opened by a county that only wanted to confirm a building still stood. It's a long way from the high country to my door, I tell myself that, but it only ever moved at the pace of a man walking, and I gave it 3 full miles of my own stride to study and learn and make its own. And the thing about something that has spent 30 years on the wrong side of a locked door, trying to get warm, is that it has nothing in the world but patience. And the thing about snow is that it falls a little earlier every year now, and there will be a great deal more of it before this winter is done. And the thing I can no longer tell myself I'm imagining, the thing I no longer have to wonder about when I stand at that covered window in the dark, is that it is not out in the yard anymore, waiting for me to come outside. It already walked up to the glass. It already leaned in. It already breathed. And so the print I'm afraid of now is not the one in the snow. It's the next one. The one that won't be in snow at all. The one I'm going to find some morning on the warm side of the door, on my own floor in the heat I keep paying for, smooth and soft and 4 feet off my right shoulder, going out, that I don't remember making.